sector workers earn more than that, should they? Vince Cable.
Well, I certainly think they should be looked at very critically. We have too many people who are paid far too much at the top of the public sector, and that's absolutely right. There is one of the first things the government did was to set up a group under Will Hutton, look at public sector pay differentials and how we can reduce them. I think one of the first decisions I made, actually, as a minister, was to appoint somebody at the head of the Royal Mail, who was actually paid rather less than they'd been paid previously. So there are things we can do about this. And there are areas like public sector pensions. Nobody begrudges public sector pensions to people on low pay, but some of the packages for people at the top end of the public sector, particularly in the quangos, are outrageously generous. So you're quite right. We have to make tough decisions on public spending, and we should start there.
How does it come about that these public sector, after all under government control salaries or under local authority salaries, have risen so far? 50%, I think. The top salaries have risen in the last 10 years?
Well, I think it's quite possibly because there's been a great deal of complacency about it. There was a race to compete with what are often equally ludicrous salaries in the private sector. But, now we're in difficult times. We're going to have to make sacrifices, and let's look at excessive pay where it is excessive at the top of the public sector, including this vast army of quangos, which are often out of direct government control, but where you get a lot of these abuses.
The chief executive of Liverpool City Council earns £197,500 more than Prime Minister. I'm not quite sure why. I think Prime Ministers would often do it for free, actually, wouldn't they? I don't think they need to be paid at all. But anyway, is it right that
Cameron can afford to do it for free?
Is it right in your view that a chief executive of a council like Liverpool, John Redwood, should be paid more than the Prime Minister?
I think you've got to judge each case on its merits, but I think chief executives of local authorities in general should not be rewarded as if they were the chief executives of profit-making businesses in competitive markets, because they have two very big differences from a CEO of a private company. One, the money comes in whatever they do, whereas a CEO of a profit-making company has to work very hard to win clients and get people to spend their money with that company, and if he doesn't, his pay isn't available, and nor is that of his staff. And the second reason is that the chief executive of a profit-making company is responsible for the strategy to the board and has to work very hard to work out the whole plans of the company, whereas, of course, the strategy of the council is laid down by the ruling group. So I think there are two huge differences between the so-called chief executive role in a council and that in a profit-making company. So I think we've been mistaking ourselves by drawing this false analogy. And I think lower pay in general for general managers of councils, which is what they are, serving the ruling group and through the ruling group the local population, which would be much more appropriate in an age of austerity.
Okay. You, sir. Yes.
Yeah, I am a public sector worker. I am a civil servant. And we're in a position now where not only are we facing the threat of redundancies, but we've also got a cynical right-wing government looking to cut our redundancy payments at the same time. Yet the Tax Justice Network are saying that there's 120 billion either not collected, avoided or evaded. Yet at the same time we're making revenue staff redundant.
Okay.
Does the panel believe that's right?
Ian Hislop?
No, I mean, it seems incredibly stupid for Her Majesty's Customs and Revenue to be cutting the number of people chasing money. And there is a great deal of uncollected tax. I mean, there's 6 billion from Vodafone, which I think Vince is going to collect tomorrow.
Yes, indeed. Yes. One of the announcements during the week, which you probably heard, was that Danny Alexander made, the Chief Secretary of Treasury, is a substantial amount of additional resources to catch tax revenue that is currently evaded on an industrial scale. And the problem was that when Gordon Brown was trying to make some economies a few years ago, he didn't think it through, took enormous numbers of people out of HMRC, particularly from enforcement, where a lot of people are abusing the tax system. We're now reinstating that to ensure that these people pay their share.
And are you telling the head of HMRC that his policy of it's not all black and white and we've got to deal fairly with some of these big companies should be reversed And can we have the money?
We are saying that, and indeed
Good.
he was rebuked by the Chancellor of the Exchequer for his complacency of the tax.
Are you comfortable with being advised by one of the biggest avoiders, legal avoiders of tax, Sir Philip Green, in all this?
Well, I've said on several occasions, and I won't withdraw the fact, that he earns a lot of his income in the UK and he should pay his taxes here.
Can I just come back about, you raised the 7
Yes.
billion Danny Alexander's mentioned. The estimate is 120 billion. So he's looking to raise less than 7% of that amount. If I only achieve 7% of my job, somehow I don't think I'll be in the job next week.
I'm going to come to Caroline Flint. Thanks very much for the point. Caroline Flint, do you think it was right that in the past 10 years, under Labour, the top 5% of earners in the public sector salaries went up by 51%?
I think it's one of the areas we did get wrong in terms of not attending to it. In the areas that we control, local authority rates for chief executives are obviously set by local authorities, not by government, but I think it is something we should have done more on. I think one of the arguments was that somehow, if you take local government, where I used to work many years ago, the idea was that, you know, you had to be competitive with the private sector and therefore you had to have these salaries. I think actually, I'll try it out tonight, I think if probably you looked at every chief executive of every local authority in the country, most of them are probably local authority career people. They're not from the private sector. So we've ended up, I'm afraid, with a cabal of people setting this rate, which actually isn't about competition and about getting in new talent. And I think it has gone wrong along the way, and I certainly think with some of the quangos as well, and it does need to be attended to, and I think some of that, to be honest, in government we got wrong.
Okay. You said on that. Yes.
While some of them may be overpaid, do you not think that the Prime Minister's future revenue is what...
What, in the light of Tony Blair's earnings after leaving office, you mean?
Lecture tours and books and things like that. You can become Prime Minister with a view
Yeah, but compare that to Gordon Brown's future earnings.
You don't know what they are. You don't know what he's going to do yet.
Over 10 quid, I would think.
You don't know what he's going to do or what he's going to say.
Blair is a good vote-winning tactic.
He pays his taxes.
The man there, yes.
The comparison's been made between chief executives in the public sector salary and the Prime Minister. The real comparison should be chief executives' pay and the rest of us who work in the public sector. And just one kind of final point. Successive governments have encouraged local authorities to act like businesses. Is it any wonder chief executives have then decided that they should be paid exactly in the same way as the private sector?
Mehdi Hasan.
Just picking up on that. I mean, first of all, Vince mentioned Danny Alexander's wonderful move this week to crack down on tax avoidance. Danny Alexander sold his house and declared it as his main property to avoid capital gains tax, while telling the parliamentary authorities it was his second house so that he could claim the full expenses on it. So, do as I say, not as I do, I think is the phrase. On the subject of the pay, the gentleman says the main comparison is between public sector bosses and workers. It's not actually. The main comparison, which this government have glossed over, is between public sector bosses and the bosses of private sector companies. Vince mentions that Will Hutton was appointed to look at pay. Why was Will Hutton was appointed to look at pay? Why was Will Hutton only asked to look at public sector pay? And the ratio is 20 to 1. He was told to look at where bosses get more than 20 times the salary. If he'd gone to look at our FTSE 100 companies, he'd see that the ratio between bosses and workers in the private sector is 66 to 1. And that's what's infected our public sector. That's what's led to chief executives of councils, GPs, and all sorts of other public sector employees demanding more and more cash in order to keep up with all these greedy people in the private sector. And one very last point. John said that the difference between the public sector and the private sector is that the money comes in for public sector employees no matter what they do, really, and that doesn't happen in the private sector. Eric Daniels, the boss of Lloyds, is going to retire next year with a pension of 200 grand a year and a payout of something near £14 million. His bank failed, we bought it and saved it for him. So let's talk about failure.
Shouldn't have done it then, should you?
I'd take one brief point from the man there.
I know someone who works in the public sector, and from their experience, they know that the executive in their office does not work anywhere near as hard as the people in her department work. Why is this person, the executive, getting paid 10 times more than she is when she and people around her are doing 10 times more work